This program is presented by University of California Television. Like what you learn? Visit our website or follow us on Facebook and Twitter to keep up with the latest UCTV programs. Also, make sure to check out and subscribe to our YouTube original channel, UCTV Prime, available only on YouTube.
I'm Yuri Slesky, and I'll be the moderator. There are nice paragraphs about all three of them in the program, so I will not introduce them, other than to say that that Steve Fish is one of the most intellectually stimulating and engaging colleagues I have here at Berkeley. And Steve Hansen is one of the most prominent and theoretically sophisticated members of our field. In fact, just about a week ago, he was elected president of the American Association of Slavic, East European, and Eurasian Studies. So, so congratulations to Steve. You may have noticed at the previous panel we had a vice chancellor and an ambassador, actually referring to each other as provost, I think, right? In George's case, an ambassador. So we have a president at this panel. And then we, of course, have what George Breslauer referred to as the leading light. And that's Masha Lipman, who is indeed the leading light of Russian journalism today. She also happens to be a close friend, actually one of two closest friends I have, the other one being her husband. So in case of doubt, I will take Masha's side and manipulate the rules in her favor. So we will proceed as follows. Steve Fish will begin by presenting some facts and a lot of theory. And then Steve Hansen will, actually I'm not sure about the proportion of facts and theory, and Steve, about 50-50. And then Masha Lipman will present a lot of facts and perhaps some theory, no theory. Okay, then they will talk to each other for maybe 10 minutes or so. And have a sort of mostly amicable, I think, and I hope inconclusive discussion, and then we will have about 20 minutes left for your questions. So Steve, the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot, Yuri. It's hard to know how to wrap up a conference like this. At first I was a little disappointed that we had to shift venues. I thought this was really awkward, but this is no fault of the organizers. We just got timed out of the other place, but now I'm actually kind of glad. This is really a very nice room and a nice place, I think, to end up. And I join Yuri in congratulating everybody for either breaking through the bushes, breaking through one of the other doors, surviving the strip search at the back door, and getting in here in one piece. I'm not really sure. They said there's construction going on out there, but there's no construction going on. So it's kind of, this is an appropriate way to end, to do a Russia panel, right? I mean, not anymore, but there's no anymore, right? So, okay, so listen, the question I want to address in this, in our closing panel is a fairly straightforward, simple one, but I'm going to give you maybe kind of a straightforward but still complicated, theoretically complicated answer, which is, why is Putin so popular? You know, this guy has been in power now for 12 years, and you'd think that even a relatively successful politician would be really taking it on the chin from the people after 12 years, wouldn't be very popular. He's rigged the elections. He picked his own opponents in the last presidential election. I was there in Vladivostok and watched this travesty unfold. It was a complete joke. There was no pretense that this was a real election. There was no pretense that the ballots were counted fairly. This was just Putin kind of showing everybody how powerful he was. And yet, there's no doubt that Putin still does enjoy a great deal of popularity, and that he wouldn't be as strong as he is vis-a-vis the elites, and he wouldn't have the kind of governance capacity that he does without having a great deal of personal charm for a lot of Russians. I wouldn't even say it's a majority anymore, but I would say in a pinch, if the ballots had been counted fairly, he probably still would have gotten half of the vote, not the 2/3 he claimed. I think even if he would have let real opponents run against him, he would have gotten a plurality in the first round, gone to a second round, and won, the way Yeltsin did in 1996. Now, the question of why he didn't allow that to happen is an interesting one. Yeltsin was ready to kind of, face the possibility of losing. Putin would have almost certainly won in a fair election, thereby rendering Russia much more governable, because then he would have been able to claim he's presiding over a democratic regime. He chose instead to show people who was boss, right? And most Russians actually, or let's say 40, 50% of Russians said, that's okay. That's all right. And in fact, there's been remarkably little protest. If we compare what went on in December after the parliamentary elections, if we compare what went on after Putin's election, the reactions to the imprisonment now of these rock stars who have been unfairly imprisoned for mild acts of civil disobedience, this all is really child's play. This is nothing compared to what we've seen in the other region we're studying in this conference, which is in the Middle East. I mean, Egyptians wouldn't take this lying down from Mubarak. They certainly would. They wouldn't take it from their own government. Russians do. And the argument I'm going to make is that it's really not about Russians. It's not about the Russian psyche. It's not about Russian defeatism, although I know Russians are cynical about politics. It's about Putinism and Putin himself. And I'm going to claim that that Putin governs differently than most authoritarian rulers, and in a kind of systematic, identifiable way. Or at least Russians believe he does. And I think there's some empirical basis for believing that he does. So let me start off with that big question, and then backpedal to some big theoretical questions. Economists tell us that we human beings are selfish, greedy, acquisitive, to the nth degree. That we would rather have the extra $1 for ourselves with already $1 million in our pocket than to give $1 to a man who has none and save him from starvation. That is the classical economist assumption. Okay? Now, that would be very easy to actually dismiss if it weren't so richly supported by the empirical evidence. That, in fact, is the way most human beings act most of the time. If this weren't true, then we could adopt the Platonic answer to government of just finding a really good man to govern us, who was not self-interested, who was interested only in the commonweal, and we could put him in charge of government. But ever since Jeremy Bentham and Immanuel Kant and many other 17th, 18th, 19th century theorists, we've actually known, of course, that, and Madison prominently among political theorists, we've known that men are not angels, and no given man is going to be an angel for very long once he is in power, once she is in power, and therefore we need to divide up powers. According to the logic of this argument, and every economist makes this assumption, and most political scientists make this assumption, dictators will always steal as much as they can. If you're not accountable to ordinary folks, you're going to steal as much as you can get away with stealing. The assumption here is that people are in the business of accumulating as much not only power, but stuff as they can. And again, interestingly, when we look around the world, what we see, in fact, is a great deal of empirical support for this very skeptical about human nature hypothesis. As we look around most democratic regimes, we see rulers grudgingly serving the popular interest when they have to, which is to say most of the time in well-established democracies, and stealing not that much simply because they get caught very often. They do get caught a lot, and they're worried about re-election. In dictatorships, so goes the logic of this argument, the dictator will steal as much as he can and stay in power, which means, in the words of, in the phrasing of Bruce Bueno de Mesquita in a recent book on authoritarian rulers will always form a minimum winning coalition. They will pay off just as many people and not one person more than they need to stay in power. And they'll appropriate the rest for themselves. You can just make that assumption. And in fact, as we look around the world, this actually is usually what happens. But there are exceptions. Every now and then one encounters regimes that are actually run by people who do not steal quite as much as they could. all right? And I'm going to call those kinds of regimes demophiles, and I'm going to call those kinds of rulers demophiles. They're not democrats. Krasi means rule by. They're not democrats. They don't want the people to rule, the demos to rule. But they're demophilic. They love the people. They do stuff for the people, okay? And their claims are not entirely empty. I'm taking this term from Giovanni Sartori, the great political theorist of whom I think Ned Walker was the last fruit at Columbia before Sartori went into retirement. I hear he's still alive and kicking around at 104 or whatever he is now. He came up with this notion of demophilia in the 70s to criticize Soviet-style regimes' claim that they embodied a higher form of democracy. Right? And he said, these guys claim to be demophiles. They're not Democrats because they don't even pretend really to be free elected, but they claim to care about the people more than democratically elected politicians do because they're free from the pressures of the interests of large capitalists and so on. And so he said, he ridiculed this term. He said, demophilia is what they claim to be, but demophilia is ultimately no substitute for democracy because you can't really trust the bastards for very long once they're in power, okay? I don't want to use the term exactly the same way he did. He was undoubtedly right to say that Soviet rulers were not, in fact, Democrats. He was right to even imply that they were false demophiles. A demophilic ruler, in fact, doesn't act the way most Soviet rulers did, and I'll get to that in just a second. All right? So I think we can actually take Sartori's term and run with it, and here I'm going to use it somewhat differently. And I'm going to define a demophilic regime as one that does not act democratically, meaning that it subjects its office holders to regular, open elections for office, competitive elections, okay? But that nevertheless acts in a way that is not what classical economic theory would expect out of us, which is to say its rulers do not take as much as they might. What's interesting is that this notion of demophilia is really on the rise in the world. It isn't being termed this by a lot of rulers, but the hegemony of the democratic idea is in fact waning now. And it has been waning for 2 decades. It kind of peaked in 1992, 1995, when even the most vicious dictator claimed to be a Democrat. These days, people, including Putin, who are not Democrats, very often don't pretend to be. They say democracy really doesn't get you the security and the economic growth and the things that really care about. A self-selected technocratic elite can do better. No, I spent the last 2 summers in China, and I can tell you, Chinese rulers don't call it a democracy. There's no more pretense this is a people's democracy, a popular democracy, a capitalist democracy. They don't use the term. They shun the term. They say democracy gets you what you have in point-to-country with lots of chaos in it. Greece is now on Chinese news all the time, right? This is what democracy gets you. Or, you know, Mitt Romney in the United States, okay, something like that, or you name it, or George W. Bush. Okay, this is the fruit of democracy. You really want that? No, you don't have democracy here, of course not. There's no more pretense it's a people's democracy. What you have is a really well-run technocracy that is demophilic, that cares about your interests, okay? And what's interesting about this is that, in fact, in demophilic regimes, the people do not rule, and yet the rulers actually do act, to some extent, like the people do rule. So these are atypical forms of authoritarianism. They are authoritarian, but the leader still nevertheless acts as if he owes his power to the people. In a demophilia, the ruler does not steal as much as he might. His hands might not be spotless, but he appropriates for his own enrichment a considerably smaller portion of national product than he actually could, thereby leaving the lion's share available for investment, reinvestment in the economy. The ruler channels funds into investment in infrastructure, the provision of public services, education, other things that people actually value, military spending in countries where people care about national glory, things like this. The people cannot punish him for failing to do so, but he does so anyway. He generally prizes and prioritizes the same things the demos does, which is typically economic growth, social well-being, infrastructure, national greatness, poverty reduction, and things like this. He may show this or that group favor, but he does not attempt to wipe out or attack whole classes or ethnic groups. By no means could we call Stalin, for example, a demophilic ruler. The demophile doesn't target portions of the population for elimination or rule on behalf of one particular part of the demos, be it a class or a tribe or an ethnic group, over and against others. The demophile represents or pretends to represent all of the people of the country. He eschews dynastic succession. He is not a sultanistic ruler. He or she rules without planning the continuation of his rule by his sons. Here we can rule out people like Nazarbayev and his regime in Kazakhstan, or the Mubarak regime in Egypt. The Mubarak regime, for 100 different reasons, was not a demophilia, but here's one of them. Now, the Belarusian regime as well, where the young child of Alexander Lukashenko is being groomed now for succession, even though he's only, 12 years old? How old is the kid? I can't remember, but he's already kind of going to be the new Tsar of Belarus in 20 years, according to his dad. So the interesting thing about the demophilic ruler is that he's not only well-intentioned, but he's also minimally competent. He actually does things that make economies work reasonably well. So who are demophiles? Okay? Well, a lot of very popular rulers in the world who rule in non-democratic regimes, but are popular anyway, do not qualify as demophiles, okay? So, for example, Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana, between 1966 and 1966, the first post-colonial ruler of Ghana, and many people still think of as the father of modern Ghana. President Sukarno, the ruler of Indonesia between the time of independence and when he was ousted in 1965, 1966. Nasser, the ruler of Egypt between the early 1950s and 1970s. These are guys who were authoritarian and very popular when they were in office, but who do not qualify as demophiles. Why do they not qualify as demophiles? Because they made a hash of their country's economies. They knew they were making a hash of their country's economies, but they still subordinated the economic well-being of ordinary people to grandiose, glittering projects that got a lot of public attention while actually bringing ordinary people very little benefit. Okay? That's not a demophilic ruler either. I'm not just talking about popular authoritarians. I'm talking about a specific type of authoritarian ruler. Okay? So, Mao Zedong, certainly no demophile. He was an absolute disaster. He visited disaster upon his people time and time and time again, economically and politically. And when the evidence was in that people were dying in large numbers, he simply roped off those regions and let them starve. This is not what demophilic rulers do. So who are the demophiles? Okay, the big example now these days, of course, is the Communist Party leadership in China. These people are ruling on behalf of the folks, at least this is their claim, and after 32 years of 10% a year growth rates on average, and a country going from being Central African level of development, African Republic level of development, to a level of development that puts it already, or will put it in the next 5 years, in the realm of the world's advanced industrialized countries, with all the increases and improvements in human welfare that have accompanied that, has very good claim to that status. And Chinese people see it as having very good claim to that status. And most Chinese, in fact, do not seek revolution. They're perfectly happy with the regime as it is. Of course, they'd like to make some adjustments, and they'd like more freedom, civil freedom, but most Chinese I know don't actually seek revolution. Okay? The Park Chung-hee regime in South Korea, here's a guy who didn't have to rule on behalf of the people. He could have ruled like his predecessor. He came to power in a military coup. 1960, 61, he comes to power. And between 1961 and 1979, he rules South Korea, doesn't steal a red cent from the country as far as we can tell, lives modestly, and pursues policies that bring Korea into the modern industrial age with growth rates that are about the same as what China's experienced over the last 30 years. Okay? And Putinism. And Putin. Okay? Now, the argument that Putin is a truly demophilic ruler of the type that that the contemporary Chinese Communist Party rulers are, that Hu Jintao is, or that Park Chung-hee was in the 1960s and 70s in Korea, is controversial. There's no doubt about it. At the same time, and I don't mean to argue that he's as consistently demophilic, I do mean to argue the following, that at least during Putin's first term, he established a reputation as someone who actually could have gotten away with any damn thing he wanted to. And instead of stealing the country blind, like his predecessors were viewed as having actually done, even though Yeltsin personally probably didn't appropriate all that much, Putin actually doubled down and did things like pay off the national debt, increase pensions 6 times. Personal consumption in Russia, personal consumption rose at 20% a year between 2002 and 2006. And we wonder why Putin's popular, right? I mean, this is astronomical economic growth in a country that was recovering from the world's deepest recession. And the growth wasn't just because Russia finally got through the denouement of Stalinism, although that was a big part of it. It wasn't just because oil prices rose, although that was part of it. It was also because the leaders were not taking advantage of the rising oil prices and the recovery, the natural recovery of the economy as much as they could have. In other words, they weren't stealing nearly as much as they could have. Those who think that Putin brought to Russia more competent administration and less corrupt administration are absolutely right. That's precisely what he did. Okay? Now, whether he continues to do that into his second term and into Medvedev's term and into now is a different question. It's a different question. How much is Putin stealing right now? Forbes magazine says $40 billion. That would put him up there with Bill Gates, right? We don't know. I mean, you know, I suspect that he certainly has made himself very rich. But he did acquire a reputation early on that persists to this day of somebody who's actually stealing much less than he could get away with. All right? And as much as a liberal, I despise Putin and Putinism, I have to admit that when I look at the numbers on things like social welfare expenditures in oil-rich countries, Russia is in a category of its own. You compare Russia with Nigeria and Algeria, and for that matter, Kazakhstan and Azerbaijan and Turkmenistan, and democracies as well as autocracies around the world, that what you will see is, unique among at least the autocracies, Russia actually spends its oil wealth on the folks, right? This doesn't happen in Nigeria, which is a more democratic polity, which is much leakier. This does not happen in Azerbaijan. It doesn't happen to the same extent, even in some countries like Venezuela that at least are formally democratic. I have a graduate student, Marcy McCulloch, who's writing a terrific, promising dissertation on this topic, and she's showing the numbers. She's showing that as oil revenues increase by X amount in Russia, you see X amount of change in the level of pensions and education spending and infrastructure spending. Infrastructure, not so much. Putin's not doing a great job with that. But in other areas, you see commensurate rises. You compare this with Nigeria, Algeria, Venezuela, virtually every other so-called petrostate in the world, and you see nothing of the sort, because the leaders are stealing most of the money. Now, how much Putin and his cronies are stealing, we don't know for sure. We know it's a lot. But it's still not as much as they could be stealing. We know that for a fact. That's a puzzle. That is a puzzle, and that, to me, explains in a nutshell Putin's popularity. Much better than his manipulation of the media. Of course, he manipulates the media. Much better than any high-tech electoral campaign. His electoral campaign wasn't all that high-tech. Much less than his charming personality. He's not very charming. Much less than his exploits on horseback and on hang glider, which most people just laugh at. Even ordinary working people in Russia are now laughing at that stuff. He does that for fun, right? And I think to kind of lighten up his public image. But people aren't taken in by that. They like him because what they see is when oil prices rise and the economy gets better, their lives get better. Now, I will just leave you with that, okay? But I do want to say one final thing, which is explaining why Putin has chosen a relatively demophilic path rather than either a democratic path or the typical autocrat's path, which is one that's all about stealing and rapaciousness. We don't know. We don't know. I have a few hypotheses we could talk about in Q&A if anybody's interested, but I don't have a good explanation for that.
Okay, our next speaker is Stephen Hansen.
Thanks very much. Is this working now? Not particularly. There we are. Great. Well, it is a great pleasure to be back in Berkeley, my hometown, by the way. I was born in Herrick Hospital, so it always feels great to be here. And I did get my doctorate here as well. And also with this distinguished company. So thank you so much for bringing me along. I'm going to argue today that there are 5 reasons why the revolution that seemed to be brewing in Russia last fall into the winter hasn't succeeded, and why the regime seems to be stable. And there's one big reason why it may nevertheless collapse. collapse. And that's going to take the second half of this little mini lecture. So first, the 5 reasons why the regime is still in power. And these are all structural reasons. So I want to start by pointing out structure does matter, resources matter, power matters, and here are the basic facts that we all know, but they're worth going down. And the first one is oil. It's come up many times in the conference. Steve Fish has written many eloquent chapters and articles about this. Others have too. And it really does matter, and it really does hurt democratic prospects when you have an elite that can basically survive on just exporting oil. As long as the price of oil doesn't go below $90, $80 a barrel. It flirted with that for a while in the recession. Now, of course, things are moving back up again. You have 40% of government revenue basically coming out of one particular product, and it gives you literally hundreds of billions of dollars that you can use to pay off adversaries as long as they're not too virulent. You can use it to reward friends and cronies. You can use it to have PR campaigns. You can occasionally go hang gliding with that money. So I won't belabor the point, but it really does matter. By the way, it does show that if ever an alternative energy source that's really serious gets developed, a major source of Putin's power in the regime will be eliminated quickly. But it doesn't look likely, and there has been no sign of any diminution or, by the way, any diversification of the Russian economy, despite a lot of calls by economists to do that. Natural gas matters less now because the price of natural gas has gone down with fracking, but oil still matters a lot, and it gives them a lot of money. Second, the elite is pretty united. If you look at theories of revolution in comparative politics and sociology, you'll see one of the key factors everybody points to as really important for regime collapse is that elites start falling out with each other. They start attacking each other rather than defending the order. And while there may be some internal fissures, and certainly there's factionalism in Putin's elite, I would argue that the really inner core of the elite is still pretty united. This is a group of people who've known each other now for many, many years, many decades in most cases. They are drawn from circles around the former KGB, and they are very proud of that fact. They have a certain kind of esprit de corps from feeling like they rescued the Russian state from the near oblivion brought on by horrible liberals and Western paymasters. And I think they take that very seriously. They feel that they rescued Russia and that they are basically macho leaders who deserve to share in the spoils. And again, no real sign of that inner core falling out, which is an important reason why the regime can get through protests without really serious disruption. Also, theories of revolution will tell you that you need to have united oppositions for revolution to occur. There has to be some kind of social mobilization by ideologues or by effective leaders of social movements who get the people to think of themselves as the people, as a united force. And despite the tendencies in Russia to move toward that outcome over the last, especially 6 months or so, almost a year now, still there's quite a lot of division. So the Russian opposition remains pretty badly divided ideologically between liberals on the one hand, nationalists on the other, some figures who are kind of murky and hard to figure out. They may belong to the regime, they may not belong to the regime, nobody quite knows. When somebody like Kudrin, the former finance minister, comes up at an opposition rally, there's always a debate. Do we give him the stage? Do we not give him the stage? I mean, he was basically Putin's main guy for most of the decade, and now he's the opposition, or is he? He actually says he's a friend of Putin's, and Putin sort of returns the favor. So that's the opposition. So you've got an opposition that's got a lot of confusion about who's in the lead. Navalny, the famous blogger, who maybe most people saw this winter as the possible charismatic, good-looking future of the Russian opposition, has fallen into trouble because no one can quite tell if he's a nationalist or if he's a liberal. And so although people certainly see him as important, difficult for everybody to unite behind him. And now, of course, he's being threatened with imprisonment for stealing forest products. I just won't comment on that charge. The fourth reason that the regime has been able to endure this set of protests is a pretty severe divide between major cities in Russia and the social structure in the periphery, we might say, or in smaller towns in the rural sector. There are such giant cultural gaps between elites in Moscow, St. Petersburg, and some other large cities who, for example, really like Pussy Riot and think that that might be the future of the Russian society, and those who just are aghast and who are much more religious, much more nationalistic, much more suspicious of outside influence. And so, not that revolutions require the entire society to rise up at once, that's never the case, but it has been the case that the same people who like Putin a lot, and I guess I disagree a little with Steve on this one, the demophilia maybe is there, but a lot of it rests in a particular section of Russian society. People who are in the big cities are getting pretty disaffected. And then the fifth reason the regimes survived is what the famous book of Albert Hirschman taught us, which is exit. It's possible to leave. And this, despite the non-waiver of Jackson Vanik to this day, there's no restriction on immigration from Russia. And that helps a lot for regime stability. It's a lot like the Castro phenomenon in Cuba, where if you can get away, you don't leave the opposition at home, you go to England or you go to the United States and teach. And there are some courageous people, some on the panel, who've been fighting the good fight within the country, but it is very difficult. And so the fact that you can get away means some opposition leaders do choose to do so, and just the general intellectual brain drain, as it's referred to frequently in Russia, has tended to undercut some kinds of mobilization that might have occurred, ironically, if the system were closed to immigration. When you put those 5 factors together, that's a pretty powerful case for regime stability, I would argue. If we just look at this from a comparative politics perspective, I teach my students to think comparatively. Say a country with a lot of oil money, it can distribute pretty easily, a country with a fairly united authoritarian elite that has an esprit de corps, a country with a divided opposition that doesn't have ideological unity or trust in particular leaders of the opposition, a country that is quite divided socially between its urban and non-urban segments, or less big city segments, and finally a country where you can exit fairly easily, and many do, both in terms of their capital and in terms of their human capital. That's a regime that's hard to overthrow for the opposition. Having said all of that, I want to say in the second half of what I want to say here that there's one big factor, as I say, which actually can bring the whole thing down tomorrow. And tomorrow is actually irrelevant. It's not just a metaphor. There's a march tomorrow, the March of Millions, which we'll have to watch closely. When you wake up in the morning, we'll see how it went. There is, I think, a pretty fundamental collapse of the legitimacy of the Putin regime. I think actually in here, again, it'll be interesting in discussion because we disagree. Over the last year, the change in the attitude toward the regime that I saw on trips to the region, pretty much every trip, it's shifted in a very dramatic way. I used to have Russian friends who thought of themselves as liberal Democrats say things to me like, yeah, Putin's election in 2004 was illegitimate in the sense that we know the elections were fake and we know lots of people were disqualified from the ballot, but that's no different from your American elections with the Supreme Court deciding 5-4 who goes to office and the Electoral College throwing out the popular will and, Florida shenanigans. I mean, this notion of so-called double standards, dvoynie standardy, was the kind of constant refrain that anyone you talk to in Russia, whether they were conservative or liberal, they'd say, please don't tell us how to be a democracy, because your so-called democracy has all the same problems. Not so today. When you go today to talk to Russians, at least in my circles, and you say, so what do you think? Obama versus Romney, Obama actually won. That was surprising to a lot of Russians. They didn't believe a black man could be president of the United States. They were surprised that the kind of Bush-Clinton family dynasties got broken somehow. So the cynicism that had emerged about U.S. democracy really stopped. And then now another election that looks quite real and quite, the choices are very different from one another. Whereas in Russia, you've had this bizarre episode of the Medvedev fake presidency, which now is obviously fake, and which both sides have admitted is fake, basically publicly admitted was fake from the very beginning. And that changed the deal. So now nobody in Russia says, oh, your fake democracy in the United States is no better than ours. Ours is a little funky, but yours is too. People know theirs is fake. And they're actually just laughing now publicly all the time in the Kremlin. When Peskov, the spokesman for Vladimir Putin, came out last fall and said that the Greek vases that Vladimir Putin had miraculously recovered from the Black Sea on his famous dive. I don't know if you all know this. He showed up having, just found priceless vases of the past. And Peskov came out in an interview and said, well, of course we placed them. Of course that was fake. Same with the cranes. So now they just admit all the time on television that what they do is fake, which I think is kind of stupid. I mean, from a political science perspective, if you're going to do PR stunts, don't then say, that was a funny PR stunt. It's not demophilic because it shows a lack of respect for Russian citizens to make their own decisions about what's right and wrong. It's basically showing Russia, we don't care what you think, we can just have a good time. So this matters. Now, it leads us to a big problem in political science theory. And I only have about 6 minutes, so I have to go through it a little more quickly than I'd like. But we're not very well equipped to deal with the question of when people are cynical and when they organize around ideas in democratic revolutions. And the reason for that is that the dominant theories out there, and especially rational choice theory, have as an axiom this idea that every political actor is automatically always maximizing power and income, usually just power. Since we assume from the outset that politicians are power maximizers, there's no way to ever differentiate, except I agree with you that some leaders may do a little better for their people, but we immediately assume that that's discounted by some strategic reason that they do it. What matters in Russia today, then, is there's a differentiation of people who are starting to say there's nothing left of this regime but power maximization. And conversely, people in the opposition who are saying, maybe I can trust the opposition leaders. Maybe the fact that some of them were Democrats in the 90s and associated with Yeltsin, I can get past that. Maybe I can trust Navalny. Maybe I can trust Gudkov of Just Russia, who was just stripped yesterday of his parliamentary immunity in the Duma for daring to oppose Putin and is now going to be part of this march tomorrow. So it'll be very interesting to watch what has been a completely cynical Russian population, and rightly so, looking at leaders who don't believe anything and steal like crazy, and looking at their own opposition figures in kind of the same way, beginning to now say things are getting so awful and so embarrassing for us as a country that maybe I got to put my trust in the popular movement. But we're not there yet. I was in Yalta for a summer school that we do every few years. Actually, Masha was there the year before, it turns out. And I was talking to my Russian, Ukrainian, and Belarusian students about Boris Nemtsov, who I think is an interesting figure. As you know, one of the kind of classic figures of the young reformer group under the early 90s, under Yeltsin, and now getting arrested, frequently. I mean, he's in all the demonstrations. He's there at the head of the movement. I said, it really strikes me that Boris Nemtsov has stood out as a principled actor in this. And everybody ganged up on me. All of my Russian friends said, oh, Boris Nemtsov, principled actor. You got to be kidding me. I mean, that guy was one of those, Chubais, Gaidar, this group of people who stole everything from the country, and it was all fake. It was all basically to line their own pockets. I said, well, wait a sec. He's getting arrested. I mean, maybe if he had $10 billion in London and he just flew there every week, you could say that. And I'm not going to say I know his bank account. But nevertheless, he's taking a risk, right? He's out there on the street. So there's a point at which if people are out there on the street enough, if they get stripped of their parliamentary immunity enough, if they start getting arrested and their friends know about it, when you take young kids who are musicians in their 20s and put them in prison for 2 years and separate them from their little kids, it changes public opinion. And I think public opinion in Russia is very volatile and shifting in a big hurry toward a result which actually does seem propitious for revolutionary change. So this is where structuralism and voluntarism have to come together in our analysis. And I'm not saying I know, of course I don't know which way it'll go. The structural variables all, unfortunately, for those who would like to see change, including me, do line up against any serious change. They really do. But the legitimacy variable is so powerful and is shifting so rapidly that it makes you wonder whether collective action of united people in Russia, especially in the big cities, who are really fed up with this abuse of power and who are really embarrassed about the image of Russia in the world today, especially with the arrest of Pussy Riot, which has just made the whole regime look ridiculous abroad. You wonder whether the point has come where the long-term thinking of opposition figures starts to trump short-term rationality. Short-term rationality would be dictated by structure. Why should I stand out? Why should I lead a protest? I'm just going to lose my job. I may lose my life. I'm certainly going to lose my freedom if I do it too often. I should escape rather than stay in Russia. Rational choice theory, if you're thinking under conditions of short-term thinking, would tell you that these revolutionary movements in Russia are bound to lose because everyone has those incentives. But if people begin to feel, because of this moral shift, if I may use that kind of an expression, that change in the impression of the regime's legitimacy or lack thereof, it makes people think there's a long-term future for Russia that they can be part of, so that instead of just taking the short-term payoff that's small and embarrassing, they shoot for a longer-term payoff of a dignified life in a democratic European Russia. Then, in fact, our own theories tell us collective action of the opposition becomes more powerful, the regime's ability to resist becomes weaker because, in fact, they start having the short-term view while the opposition takes the long-term view. You may then see defections among the elite as people fall out about whether they should arrest Pussy Riot types, whether they should use violence to put down protests that turns against them, and other hard choices that authoritarian elites have to make when mass protest becomes very serious, as it is. And you may, as I said, get a united opposition that overcomes those divisions that I mentioned before. So structural variables are not the whole story. I think that it would be a mistake to conclude that this battle is one that can never be won, despite all those advantages that I mentioned. I thought last fall when I was giving this talk at Assis that we really were looking at a long-term consolidation of Putin's power after a failed protest movement. I'm actually not now sure of that. I think now that things are getting this ridiculous, it's not a political science term we use a lot, ridiculousness, but I can only come up with that term when we see when it's this out of control, it makes you wonder what may happen. And so I'll leave you on that note of possibility. Thank you.
Okay, Masha Lippman.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here, and I think I owe it to Steve Fish, who invited me to this wonderful event. Thank you all for staying through the day. I would say I too am happy to have been moved to this venue from the other one, but I think Putin would not have been happy because it's got to be his panel that is moved away from the main panel elsewhere. I think would not keep him happy. Anyway, Putin built a regime in which he enjoys 100% political control, and this is how he doesn't like to be shoved around. A regime with no competition, in which his rule is uncontested and unchallenged. In which he got rid of all the nominal institutions of democracy, in which the results of the elections are preordained, in which he's got ensured public quiescence, and he's got, I wouldn't call it like Steve did, united elites. I think he was able to impose consensus on the elites. Now, this is a wonderful way for a ruler. He doesn't face any competition or accountability. But as everything, it comes at a cost. And this is where I would disagree with Steve Fish that he manages the Russian economy reasonably well. To give just one illustration, and I will give you more a bit later, just recently we had a summit of the APEC in Vladivostok, which cost 800 times more than the APEC summit in Honolulu, 280 times more than the one in Singapore, 72 times more than the one in Japan cost. This is just to give an idea of how reasonably well the Russian economy is managed, especially compared to China. Other costs, well, this one I would define as inefficiency of governance. Another one is, of course, corruption and predatory practices of the elites. And another one is cynicism that Steve Hansen mentioned, and alienation, increasingly deepening alienation between people and the government. Another cost to this kind of rule is the ultimate destruction of the rule of law, even the promise of the rule of law in Russia. However, the status quo that Putin was able to establish, and by the way, he was able to establish it to his credit, basically without resorting to the use of force. By a combination of different means, of which I agree with Steve Fish here, improving people's living standards is major, he was able to achieve this basically 100% control over politics, without resorting to violence. And the status quo was acceptable, and the status quo was actually going on year after year after year up until last fall. And here I would disagree with Steve Fish again because he dismissed the protests as insignificant, comparing them to the Middle East. Why compare them to the Middle East? Indeed, why not compare it to Russia? This is the first time in 20 years of post-communist development that we had 100,000 people in Moscow. Maybe not a great deal. Maybe they did not achieve much. But I would not dismiss it as insignificant in comparison with the Middle East. I think it was a fairly significant development which caught unawares the society itself, Putin, the Kremlin, the elites, Western observers, domestic observers, everyone. Now, a few words about the protest and the protesters. There were causes for the protest, but there was also a trigger for the protest. If we talk about the causes, it was a combination of different things, but I would focus first and foremost on the fact that 20 years of post-communist development was the time of basically unlimited freedoms. Not the political rights, not the civil liberties that have been significantly curtailed in the past decade of Putin's rule. Individual rights. A way for self-fulfillment. And actually, the opportunity for self-fulfillment for those who sought it was fairly broad. And people learned to achieve. And they formed a constituency, and it is the same constituency that we saw in the streets of Moscow beginning in December. People who knew how to manage their lives, knew how to achieve, knew how to set themselves a goal and work efficiently toward that goal. And in the course of those years, this constituency gradually developed a taste for organized action, working for collective causes, not political, because politics was something totally uninteresting. Preordained results, I mentioned it a bit earlier, people are not blind or stupid. If you cannot achieve anything, if politics is not for you, it's for the government, why even bother and be interested? So outside of the political realm, this constituency, call them modernized Russians or urban Russians, whatever you call them, they developed a taste for not just collective action, but successful and efficient collective action in various spheres of life. Charity has become very important and effective in Russia. Those of you who may remember in the summer 2 years ago in 2010 when a collective organization of volunteers achieved what the government terribly failed on, and this is forest fires in central Russia. This same constituency and mostly people in Moscow demonstrated that they are able to organize and to manage and to establish exchange of information all in a matter of just a few days because it was about a fire. They had to act fast. It turned out that whenever there emerged a cause that was worthy of people's effort, they moved to organize, they moved to manage, to exchange the information and achieve. It was only a matter of there should emerge a political cause that would be worthy. And here we come to the trigger. What triggered the protests was the trading places between Putin and Medvedev in late September 2011, when, as Steve Hansen mentioned, people realized just how deeply they were held in deep contempt by the government, treated as sheep. That was the commonest way people would talk about that at the time. We're treated as sheep. We're treated as cattle. So that was a worthy political cause. We can go deeper into it. I don't have the time as to why suddenly a rigged election and this totally manipulated trading places was such an outrageous thing to the people because they didn't react to previous rigged elections. However, that was what happened, a worthy political cause, and people knew how to organize. And they did, not just by coming out to the streets, but also by organizing an election monitoring effort, which exposed to them and to all those who wanted to read their accounts just how rigged the election was. Now, politically, that movement was still very weak from the beginning. There are many factors, and Steve Hansen mentioned some of those, but ultimately this was not even a political movement. This was a movement of emotional outrage. This was a movement of ethical abhorrence. Just how false, how many falsehoods and lies and hypocrisy and the lack of a rule of law there is in the Russian politics. Suddenly they were awakened to it. Not that they didn't know, but they didn't care. They suddenly began to care. But rather than coming up with an agenda and a leader and a movement and a party and challenging the authorities, all they did was say to each other, basically, because they didn't have a channel to say it to the government. All they could do was take to the streets and shout. And more or less what they were shouting was Russia without Putin. This is not a political agenda, and they didn't know how to, and if not Putin, then who, then what? It was all about, we are good, moral, honest people. They are everything that's the opposite, dishonest, lying, corrupt, etc. That was their agenda, if you like. Now, because they were not political, it was actually very easy for Putin to deal with them, and he did. And actually, they didn't achieve anything at all. Putin still is in control of all his institutions, the parliament, the judiciary, big business is under control, national media are under control, everything is under law enforcement, of course. And yet, even though he achieved all these and came back to bring back the status quo, which was somewhat shattered during the time when it was Medvedev the president and Putin the prime minister, there was no longer a status quo. It's not about Putin is about to be ousted soon, but the status quo has been shaken in several ways that I will talk about now. And because there is no status quo, it's also harder for Putin to manage the country. He is still in command, but it's become harder for him. I would also disagree with you, Steve, that actually he is as much loved or admired or even supported as he was. This is not true. The numbers tell us so. His numbers may be enviable for this country or for any democratic country, but this is not the case in Russia any longer. His popularity is on decline. It's slow but steady. Also, it's not because he's failing to deliver. He delivers as well as he did, and I promised not to go into theory, and yet I will mention just Daniel Chrisman, who came up with this which looked to be very well substantiated theory that actually popularity of the Russian presidents depends, surprise, surprise, on how well they deliver. And, you know, with good math and very good books, he has been proving it for years, except that he is now proven wrong. Because Putin delivers as well as he did and promises to deliver more, but his popularity is dwindling a bit, not very significantly. It used to be to hover around 80%. It is now just over 60. Again, enviable number for a democratic leader, but, you know, it's different. So, ironically, Putin's return unsettled the status quo that he came back to consolidate. The challenges to his rule today, I would say, are of three different, well, we may think of more, I would say three different kinds. One is economic, one is demographic, and the third that I will dwell upon a little longer lies in the realm of ideas. Surprise, surprise. Now, economically, well, again, reasonably well, maybe this is reasonably well. However, Russian budget today balances at 118 roughly dollars per barrel of oil. Today's price is 116, and they have problem balancing. Comparing with Nigeria, Algeria, and whatever, well, a Citigroup study recently showed that Nigeria balances at 100, other major oil exporters at 18, 19. Russia at 118 and growing. We need more. We need more all the time because Putin needs to deliver. But he does deliver, no question about that. He will probably continue to deliver because this is critical to preserving his monopolized political position in Russia, but it costs him more and more. Now, economically, the price of oil, well, we may hope it will grow, but actually with all that we know about the world, the chances are that it will decline. Maybe not very significantly, but probably will. Demographically, Putin has been in denial of the problem. It's not of his making. We should give him credit, or rather we should not blame him for that. But in the next 15 years, Russia will lose 10 million in workforce. 10 million people, not because they will die, God forbid, but because of the demographic trends. And there's a third challenge, and the third challenge lies indeed in the realm of ideas. The way Putin responded to the protests was by pitting his less modernized constituency against his more modernized constituency. He thereby abandoned a pretense that he is a leader of all Russians. He has never been. There were always people who disliked him, but because of very clever manipulations, because people were so indifferent to politics, because they lived with their backs to politics, in a sense, he could manage it. And because he pretended there were no differences, the differences that were tearing the society under Yeltsin, Putin was able to somehow push aside, make them marginal, and create a sense that he's the leader of all Russians. But today, he is no longer the leader of all Russians. He is, in a sense, he's become a leader of a majority party, a party that does not exist. I'm not talking about United Russia. I'm not even talking about Putin's Popular Front, because this is not all Russians. This is probably a party of Putin, people who are still ready to support him. And this party needs something to tell them who they are, what Putin stands for, what they stand for, why they should support him. Because there are today Russians whom Putin considers wrong Russians, or unhealthy Russians, not ours, Russians who are not appropriate. The way he went very early in the protest was to discredit and condemn the protesters. At first he did it himself, this played against him, and then he entrusted it with other people and kept silent about them, but they were heavily discredited as sponsored by the West, inspired by Hillary Clinton, being paid for by evil forces in the West, or as bums and loafers who have nothing to keep them busy, and therefore they are freaks and homosexuals and immoral. Of course, Pussy Riot came in very useful here, engaging in perverse sexual practices, so on and so forth. So bad Russians, and not just one person, not just a small group. Well, we're talking about people who demonstrated that they could be 100,000 in the streets of Moscow. So the consequences of pitting one group, of course, a majority against a minority, but it's a sizable minority. The consequences are, okay, Putin is no longer a national leader. He can no longer claim that, and he admits that in his bizarre way. He can no longer afford his evasiveness on critical issues of the origins of the Russian statehood, Russian national identity, whether we are a nation state or still an empire or a multi-nation state. He's been evasive of all these crucial issues. He can no longer afford it. Now, this effectively has put an end to the rhetoric of mobilization, to the rhetoric of modernization. And to the practices of demobilization, pushing people away as much as possible from decision-making, not interfering, not intruding into their personal lives, not teaching them how they should live, not talking about things like values, but because today we have Russians with wrong values, question is what are the right values, and this is a big question. Now, the rhetoric of modernization indeed is gone. We no longer have it. Nobody talks about it. So Putin still tries to adhere to his evasive rhetoric and not talking about values except in very grand generalities. However, the campaign against the protesters, against Pussy Riot, against people who took part in the May 6 rally, and we have about 24 people in jail today, awaiting a trial, probably very soon. This unleashed all sorts of ugly forces that are way more radical than Putin is in denouncing the protesters, and that actually are very different strains. Nationalists, Orthodox Christian fundamentalists, radical left-wingers, not so ugly as the previous two. Anyway, all kinds of very unpleasant people who have become vocal and even physically abusive, and we have had several very unpleasant instances recently. There are also people who have come up with a supply of an ideology because they feel that Putin is in need of something. What are the values? Just very recently in a small, beautiful Russian town of Izborsk in Pskov region, there was a get-together that has come up with what is called now Izborsky Klub, the Club of Izborsk. And this is a combination of all kinds of have-beens, Soviet imperialists, Stalinists, people with raving anti-Western sentiments who have come together and have produced something that they say is an alternative, an anti-liberal alternative, they call it, because liberal policies have brought Russia to the verge of a catastrophe. By the way, this is Putin, right? Putin has been in charge 12 years. These people are still loyal to him today, but they are saying that his tenure has brought Russia on the verge of a catastrophe, and here they are with their supply of an ideology. Now, Putin probably would like to refrain from all these. Question is whether he can afford it, and what does he have to offer? To his credit, what he certainly does not buy into is Russian nationalism, Russian ethnic nationalism. But again, he has a void in place of another identity for Russians. Just very recently, he met with a group of Russian ombudsmen. We have an ombudsman in every region of Russia, believe it or not. So this whole group of people was there, and at some point, he sounded, I would say, unusually desperate, and he said, why don't you guys come up with something in place of what we had in the USSR as the Novaya Общность людей, a new community of people, Soviet people. Why don't you come up with something like that? And then one of the ombudsmen says, Россияне, which was a civic term for Russia practiced by Yeltsin, of course discarded by Putin, as he has discarded everything to distance himself from Yeltsin. And suddenly Putin is saying, yes, Россияне would be a good idea. Whether or not he meant it is not clear, but he said it, thus emphasizing that he is kind of at a loss on quite crucial issues. Now, of course, the Russian Orthodox Church, I will not go into it, but it seems like he's toying with an idea where there are people who offer and impose this idea of the church upon him. I have my very serious doubts that the church can actually fill this void for him. And we heard a lot about Egypt, very interesting numbers about Egypt this morning, and how people there are not secular. Here are a couple numbers. 65% of Russians, this is a very recent poll, say the church should not interfere with state affairs. 56% of Russians say government should not be guided by religious faith. So this is an interesting issue, what the church can or cannot do for Putin in this sense. Now, what's left for Putin is to, I'm afraid, to increase the repressions. We have, in fact, again, compared to, Egypt under Mubarak, this may be a joke, but compared to what we had before, we had raids, we had searches, we had arrests, we had the Pussy Riot trial, absolutely outrageous, absurd, obscurantist trial. We have 24 people who I mentioned awaiting a trial on totally trumped-up charges. We have this deputy stripped of his immunity that Steve Hansen mentioned. We have Alexei Navalny, who's, by the way, under prosecution and quite possibly will be arrested. So this may be a way out, and it's not that actually the protesters, however we define them, the modernized Russians, have anything to oppose to a crackdown. They will be intimidated if the crackdown continues. Of course, they will be. All that will be left will be a few radicals who will be easier to deal with because there will be much fewer. But where does it take Russia? I think, well, my point, and I'm almost done, my point is it's becoming increasingly more difficult for Putin to govern. I'm not saying this is he's reached a point where he would step down in tears or be ousted, but it's getting more difficult. A crucial factor that has not happened, that I think Steve Hansen also mentioned, is what is happening with the elites. Of course, there's a lot of discontent among the elites. Of course, the elites are not united, but the imposed consensus still works. The imposed consensus means that pledging allegiance to the regime pays off, and any other behavior would be insane, quixotic, suicidal, what have you. They have examples, they've learned the lesson. But will there come a moment, a time, a tipping point when actually the elites will begin to realize that it is not paying off as well as it used to? What it might lead to is also a different question. I do not, and I think we should not expect them to wage a revolution and, reach out to the modernized protesters in the streets of Moscow. Actually, it's not at all a given that should this be the case, should the elites no longer see Putin as the guarantor of stability, as the recognized arbiter of the distribution of the rent, that we should see a liberal cohort of the elites to take power. There are all sorts of people over there, just like today in the streets we have all sorts of people. But there can be a moment that should they realize that Putin is no longer a guarantor, that they will begin figuring out ways of arbitration, not by a single person at the top, unchallenged and uncontested, but some other ways. And this would be a very interesting development in Russia and a beginning of something very new. Thank you.
Okay, well, let's give our panelists a chance to briefly respond to things that have been said so far, and then we will go to the floor. No, I think I would prefer it this way.
Okay. Thanks a lot. It's great to be here with Steve and Masha. It's such an honor to serve on the same panel with them, and they're both so articulate. And let me try to respond to a few things that they said, and in particular what Masha said, since she was taking direct issue with some of the points I was making, and I think fairly so. And she certainly knows the conditions on the ground in Russia immensely better than I do, so I have to defer to her on that. Let me just say that, I mean, she points out that Putin's popularity is not what it once was, and I agree. I wasn't claiming that it's as great as it once was, but what I'm saying is that for a guy who's been essentially the dictator of a country for 12 years to still have a 60% approval rating, that's the puzzle. I mean, the fact that it moved from a high of 75 or high 70s to down to 60, to me isn't all that big a puzzle. The puzzle is how has a man in one of the world's most cantankerous electorates actually managed to sustain that kind of public support? I mean, that's just absolutely astronomical for someone after 12 years in any form of regime, and that to me is really something else. Now, I agree with you that Putin has not been a brilliant manager of the economy, but look, everything's relative. Most Russians still do not view democracy or a democratic alternative as being a government that is going to deliver better management of the economy than Putin has. And this is unfortunately a product of the not only mismanagement, but the inevitable catastrophes of the Russian economy in the 1990s. Unfortunately, democracy got discredited along with pauperization that happened in the 1990s for reasons that were not the fault of the liberals necessarily. I think there were some problems in terms of economic management, to be sure. A lot of it was structural and a lot of the recovery was structural. But my argument was that Putin could actually be stealing a great deal more than he is, and he's stealing little enough that he's been able to help guarantee growth rates that have averaged way over those of the average other industrialized countries, advanced industrialized countries, for the last 12 years. I mean, in 2008, I can remember a lot of us saying, me hopefully, this is it. The house of cards is falling apart. There hasn't been much diversification in the economy. Steve Hansen's absolutely right. Putin has not done a good job of diversifying the economy. He talks about it like a smart development economist, but when you look at the policies and you look at the outcome, the economy is still completely hydrocarbons dependent. That said, he did a lot of smart things. He followed the minister who wanted to take all the windfall from the oil and create a rainy day fund so he could recapitalize the banks after the financial disaster. And guess what? That disaster that was supposed to happen to the Russian economy, that was going to make it tumble much further than any Western economy, never happened. Russia will grow this year at 4%. That's 4%. That's 4 times the American economy's growth rate. And it's more than 4 times the growth rate of some European countries. You know, it's kind of holding up. I also just want to add that that I agree with you about the significance of the demonstrations, Masha. They really are a big deal. And after 10 years of silence on the part of ordinary Russians, to see 100,000 people in the streets of Moscow, I found thrilling. I thought it was absolutely incredible. This is still kid stuff. You cannot change a regime with 100,000 people who come out for a day or two. And what it takes to change a regime, or even to threaten a regime, is that has to be sustained. And those numbers in a city the size of Moscow with 12 million people have to grow to several 100,000 and 1 million. And people have to be willing to stand there day after freezing day, as they did in Ukraine, 2005, to make the Orange Revolution, as they did in Tahrir Square, to brave police batons, and for the crowds to grow day after day. In Russia, you had a one-off event that many people were hoping would lead to a series of rolling events before the presidential election, and it never happened. Okay, so I'll leave it at that.
Okay. Any other comment?
To begin with, I emphasize that I do not see the protest as a way to topple the regime. I emphasize that this is but an indicator of a kind of several processes going on in the country. Now, because we don't know how much Putin has stolen, I think we cannot say whether he has stolen too much, less than he could have, because we don't know the number. If it is indeed, well, we really don't know. And certainly this is not how people in Russia see the regime. They see it as a regime of people who steal. And actually, if you look at the polls, people in Russia are not blind or stupid. They see things for what they are. We have a steady 2/3 of the population who say civil servants do not live by the law. We have about the same number who say that the police is a threat to the people, not a force for protection. About the same number who say, if I fall victim to the arbitrary operation of the government, no court will defend me. This is quite something about the public opinion, and yet they support Putin, not because they like the way things stand, but because the status quo is preferable to change, because change is associated with the 90s, because an arrangement in which there is a strong leader at the top, and we surrender responsibility because that's the way it's been, this still holds for a vast majority, not because they support, not because they like him. And by the way, if we look at a poll that asks questions such as, do you think Putin is smart, honest, kind, effective, fair, what have you, there is a large drop on these over the years. And the only point on which he's gone up is the point of experience. And of course, after 12 years, how can you say the person has become less experienced? And just one final point, the growth, I think, should not be compared to Europe or industrial countries. And by the way, it's gone. It's now half of what it used to be.
Okay. Luke was first.
I'm curious about the issue of elite cohesion. And I just genuinely don't know, because in a sense, the issue is it's easy to be cohesive when things are going well. And has Putinism really faced a serious economic crisis or a serious challenge? Or so how do we really know how cohesive the elite is? Because it's easy when things are going well, but the question is, in crisis, would the elite remain cohesive? And if you look comparatively, I just don't see many sources of a cohesion. There's no real party. There's no real ideology. There is the Siloviki element, if Khrushchevskaya could be right. But, on the other hand, if you look closely at those numbers, those include the MVD, the military, not just the KGB. And I'm just not, I don't know. I mean, I would be curious what you have to say about that.
Do you think so? Let's do, please, Chillin. Here you go. Go ahead.
Okay, I just, great series of discussions here. I just wanted to throw out a question about maybe a slightly different analytic approach. So, I mean, basically it seems like the analysis here of all the talks really turn around the opposition of political elites and masses. And, I mean, I can't help, I guess that this is the sociologist thinking here, that maybe Bonapartism isn't a bad framework for thinking about some of this stuff, in the sense that you have, in a way, a state-dependent dominant class, an isolated, reformist sort of urban group, and a rural non-elite that is atomized, and that, just as a way of framing the analytic issue, could we think about Putinism essentially as an alliance between the state-dependent dominant class and its leader and the rural non-elite, and an isolated kind of urban middle class, and that then the key political issue is, as you were suggesting, to form an alliance between the urban progressive or modernized wing and the rural non-elite against this statist group. It just strikes me that in a way the 18th Brumaire has a lot to say about this, but maybe this is crazy.
Okay, George, I saw George's hand up. Is he there? No, George is not here. His hand was.
Where's George?
Grisha, then Ned, and then we'll collect.
Yeah, it's again, thank you for a great panel. It's a bit of a follow-up to what you were saying. Has anybody done any kind of a study, a fanciful study? I don't know whether political sciences do that. Probably they do. If they hadn't been, kind of the manipulation of the elections, how would the elections stacked up? I know Steve said that Putin would have won, whatever. But what about the, the parliament and so on? Because we're talking, I mean, there is this sizable group. It's not clear how sizable it is, but certainly loud, of extreme, of extremists, or extreme right-wingers, who are anti-Western, anti-Semitic, anti-Central Asia, anti-Caucasus, absolutely everything. And they elicit sympathy, among a substantial section of the population. So if the Putin lid comes off, what kind of stuff begins to pour out of that pot? So in a sense,
Okay, Ned, and then.
So also wanted to say it was a great panel, but I'd like to put the two Steves on the spot here and say, you're both very prominent comparative political scientists with theoretical interests and an appropriate interest in trying to draw out broad structural factors that can drive what happens. The obnoxious question I'm going to ask is, do you think you're actually in a better position to assess the probability of what's going to happen in Russia over the next 5 years than Masha, who is a journalist that doesn't have the doesn't have all the training or theoretical interests?
I think we should just leave. I think this is it for the discussion for today. Please go ahead.
I want to say how much I learned from all three presentations, and although there were some disagreements, it seems to me it's quite theoretically quite easy to agree with all of them. I'm not sure I like the word demophilia. Couldn't we just say that Putin has shown more self-restraint than his predecessors, and that if you contrast him with a Brezhnev or a Stalin, there are many places where he has not exercised all the power he could have. I was in May at the time of these Occupy, they called themselves Occupy people in the streets of Moscow. And if you have a scale of a Mayor Kwan reaction in Oakland, I'll skip what happened in Berkeley and go straight to UC Davis. The Moscow reaction was very much like Mayor Kwan. Just let them sit there and get cold at night. And so I think it's sort of like Salazar in Portugal, that people accept. There are a lot of people who would disagree with what's happening, but they accept it because it's preferable to what they've known in the past, and they're obviously very, very edgy about change. And I have a question. It's a question of fact. How he came to power in 1999, because there were two scholars at the Hoover Institution. One of them wrote a book charging that the bombing of the bombs found in the apartment buildings was set in order to make a hero out of Putin. And there was another even more extreme article which was quickly withdrawn from the Hoover Institution website, but it was there, and I do have it, saying that there had been actual plotting with Bazayev in, of all places, Anand Khashoggi's villa down in the south of France in order to stage the problems in Dagestan and Chechnya, which made people want to have a strong leader like Putin.
Okay, maybe one more question from Jeremy in the back.
Masha, I'd like to ask you something. I heard the other day, maybe from somebody in this room, and maybe it was yesterday, it's all sort of one long day, that President Obama had confided to one of his intimates that he has found dealing with Putin recently extremely frustrating, that he's actually really been working on the current version of the reset, trying to get things going, and he's been stiffed. He's been stiffed on every effort, and it's not personal to Putin. It is the regime's stance toward the United States. Now, I ask you one, if you think that's fair and true, but if so, is it because it is still a political winner in Russia to stiff the United States? Is it still popular? Is that, you mentioned the only thing he was getting good marks for was experience. I think he's also actually, I thought I saw in polls, he was getting good marks for standing up for Russia. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And Steve Fish will go first because he has to leave us in about 5 minutes.
But that's just for a few minutes. I'll step out and then I hope, and I'll be back, and I hope everyone can be here for the final session, which is at 4:45, right?
Steve, we're going to move it up
right after this panel. Okay, that's fine. So we'll just stay put and just a minute break or so, and then we'll get into it. But just in quick response to these terrific questions. First of all, Dylan, I think you're onto something really important. It's great to have the sociologist perspective. I think that Putin may well be moving toward kind of forming this alliance between, let's say, the bottom half of the population and a certain state-dependent elite, and the folks that get left out of that are the rising urban middle class. This is actually consistent with Masha's analysis. If this is true, then what I'm calling his demophilia really doesn't necessarily apply to the whole population. What makes him a demophile, as opposed to someone like Stalin, who some apologists for Stalinism would argue was still representing the poorest in society, although I think that's nonsense, would still be that he's not attacking his opponents physically. He's not seeking to liquidate the urban middle class. But I think you're onto something important. Grisha's point about the danger of the rise of the extreme right. We heard I don't worry about this that much. I mean, we've been waiting for fascism in Russia now for 25 years, and it seems like it peaked, with the Zhirinovsky parties, 23% in 1993. And I think that most Russians are really reasonable people who hate the idea of civil war. And while, the far right can make a lot of noise and does make a lot of noise from time to time, I think the idea of them actually winning an election or even coming in second against Putin in a presidential election, something like that, is fairly small. Could they maybe in a parliamentary election with PR get 15% if there was no repression? Certainly possible, but I don't worry about them really coming to power. Ned's question I'm going to ignore, and then on the question about demophilia and saying, isn't Putin just, our colleague asked us, isn't Putin just a little more self-restrained than maybe other leaders? Well, first of all, that's the essence of demophilia, and that's what's so unusual among dictators. Most dictators, after 12 years in power, show absolutely no sign of self-restraint, and that's why everybody begins to hate them. Putin actually still shows it, but it's more than that. Putin he pursues policies people like. He pursues policies of that help pensioners out. He pursues policies that actually help industries that people care about survival. He's great on foreign policy. Russians care about national greatness the same way Americans do. He's great on those issues, not just sticking to the United States, but paying off the foreign debt for the sake of lifting Russia's status in the world. People like these policies. His policy priorities jibe with the policy intent, the policy preferences of a large portion of the electorate. That's what makes him a Demophile and not just someone who's a bit more self-restrained than most dictators.
So, starting with Lucan's question, Siloviki is too broad of a term because it's really Putin's friends who are the elites. It's not, NBD and let alone the military who are very down in the margins. So I don't like the term much. I mean, the elite is actually, we can almost number them. There might be like 25. We can sort of name the people. And they've all been in power, and they all know each other, and they keep getting rotated around the same positions. And those people have solidarity, is my view, and maybe we could debate Masha later a little on that degree of solidarity. So would they fall out under certain circumstances? Yeah, and I was saying so too. I mean, I can imagine stresses they could be under or recalculations about Putin's ability to deliver that would change the dynamic. But that solidarity, I think, has been pretty remarkably stable, actually, over the course, including Medvedev, people that were there in the 90s, Putin's friends who stayed his friends. I think, by the way, that the bigger point here is that these structural variables are all still created on some level by individual action. I am a methodological individualist. I just don't believe all individuals are always rational. They're emotional, they care about status, they care about national greatness, and they also care about making money and getting ahead. And so people are complex, but it is individuals who ultimately make the decisions that make these structures like opposition cohesion or state cohesion or willingness to stay home rather than leave. Those are the decisions that are ultimately shifting the structures. So that's where I'm going theoretically. Bonapartism, I think, is a great metaphor for Putinism, and actually I think it fits also the weaknesses of the regime. So one of the reasons why Louis Bonaparte was overthrown after Sedan so quickly and the whole regime disintegrated is that you did have this prolonged period from the 1860s on where French liberals, French Republicans especially, doctors, lawyers, people who wanted France to be something more like the French Revolution's ideals and not the fake version that they saw with all the absurdities of Louis Napoleon's aping of Napoleonic tradition but without the substance. I mean, there are many parallels. It's very interesting. And I think actually what that argues, I mean, the regime lasted from, 1851 to 1870. It's 19 years. So, yeah, you're getting there. Actually, it all fits. I agree completely with Steve Fish about the extremism. We do have data from the 90s. So there were a lot of fascists running in elections in the 90s. A lot of them were relatively open elections, and you would often see results of 1%, 2%. Zhirinovsky only was the one who was able to put together a serious electoral result among those people, and he was a fake fascist who likes to make fun of everything. And that's why people vote for Zhirinovsky, because it's very funny. It's what any Russian will tell you when they vote for Zhirinovsky. Oh, he's such a funny guy, you know. Love having that guy in the parliament.
What was the percentage you got for the 90s?
The biggest was 23% in the party list vote in 1993. At that point, yeah. But that was partly because Yeltsin had knocked everyone else off the ballot that was in that space. It was a serious question in 93, but then after that, the diminish has been, quite substantial. Well, we could debate. The last thing I think is about 99. Well, one thing about our interactions. Here's my honest opinion, and it isn't an evasion of the question. There are people who are genius at their ability to synthesize the way things are moving on the ground and have cultural sensitivity, and Masha's probably the #1 example of that. And then there are people who hopefully, and I don't know if we succeed, but create some kind of general theories that are useful in elucidating some of those tendencies by looking at the bigger picture. And anyone who thinks they can divorce themselves from the other side of that equation is not a very good scientist, because if you have no facts, your theory will be arid. And if you just have facts, I mean, we talk all the time, right? So it's not like when I have a theoretical idea, Masha says, oh, that's an interesting theory. I have no, she has opinions. And we correct, I don't know, I correct my views all the time listening to Masha. So I don't really think it's a war of theory versus facts. I think that usually you collect facts and then you test theory. So So last thing here is about 99. You know, the reason that this conspiracy theory began is that there was this very strange moment where an FSB official was basically caught planting explosives in an apartment building at the same time as those other explosives were detonated. And the head of the FSB at the time came out on television in Russia and said that had just been a training exercise in Ryazan. And so everyone said, well, that's a little weird, right? I mean, Patrushev, you know, why would you have the head of the secret police basically claiming that the same kind of activity was a training exercise? But that doesn't mean that you can go back several steps to a kind of preordained plot where everybody was thinking we have to bomb buildings to kill Russians to come to power. Those kind of theories are usually wrong because the number of steps that have to go right, quote unquote, for the person to benefit are so numerous that, I mean, most times when people conspire, which does happen, you get Iran-Contra, you get sort of embarrassing conspiracies that fall apart and everyone ends up worse off. So what seems more likely to me is that there were low-level people in the FSB who were doing business that might have been a bit shady, rather than something quite complex and unlikely. I'll stop there.
Just one moment, I will just, so you know the script. So our assignment is to stay awake until Steve Fish comes back. There will be no break between this panel and the next one, right? So take your time, Masha, and then we will ask some more questions.
Okay, I will begin with the last question about foreign policy and whether anti-American sentiments are still a winning strategy. Yes, it is, to a great extent. Works fine for Putin, and of course he would not miss the opportunity. Also, I was talking about qualities when I said that Putin slipped on all except experience. Of his policies, not all of which Steve Fish has left us for a brief moment, but this is something I disagree with him also, because there's evidence showing that some policies aren't popular, but foreign policy is popular. This is also true. People appreciate his policy. On 99, I think it's very important that the presidential election in 2000 were preceded by a parliamentary in 99, the last national election that was competitive in Russia in a very ugly way. But the Kremlin was challenged openly. The Kremlin won over those who wanted to grab power from the Kremlin elites. And after that, the presidential election did not even matter. The results were preordained. Putin was anointed by Yeltsin. Yeltsin's people, not Yeltsin himself, won the parliamentary in 99 in the spring of 2000, and the election went very smoothly for Putin and was not competitive. Whether or not these explosions played a role, it's hard to say, but Steve said it all. Now, on whether there may be alliances, if I got you correctly, I would point out there is a work that was published in late 2011 in Russia, and that's become immensely popular, and everyone quotes it. It's called Four Russias, that in fact it's not divided just between big cities and villages, but there are four basic categories defined economically, depending on which kind of economy people work in. So protesters would derive from post-industrial economy. This is not all big cities. Some big cities are fairly Soviet industrial cities still and do not produce the kind of electorate. So, and alliances in Russia are a problem. People are not cohesive. There is a very good book by Henry Hale called Why Not Parties in Russia, which explains it. And the bottom line is people have very serious problem coming together. For a cause, maybe, but not for a party, for staying together for a set of ideas. Now, on Lucan's question, I actually do not believe people there are cohesive, but it depends very much on who are the people. If we think 5 people, those billionaires who enrich themselves under Putin, and this is another issue I will take with Steve, just how much more wealth was accumulated, how many more billionaires we have today. So I don't think they stole only as much as I don't know, the self-restraint dictated them. But even if we take these people, they are certainly not cohesive. And actually, right now, as Putin's legitimacy is a bit eroding, promoted, as his popularity goes down a little bit, we see more of the conflicts coming to the fore. And the most notable among them is between the two men who were appointed, kind of one by Putin and another by Medvedev, the other by Medvedev, to be in charge of the oil and gas. And the two men are not on good terms. And this is very obvious in public these days. Of course, Putin's man is winning over, just like Putin is winning over Medvedev, and Medvedev is barely with left with any authority these days. But I don't think there's cohesion, and there is the imposed consensus that still works. But there are certainly conflicts that prevent them from being cohesive. On the, Grisha, your question, I actually agree with both Steves. I don't think this is such a big danger in Russia. There are good studies of nationalists done these days, not back 12 years ago. There is a very good expert who has worked with these organizations, whatever you call them, groups. And he's a liberal, very nice guy. He is in every way kind of person who would be terribly afraid of just such a prospect. His sense is there are not too many, extremely split, even more than liberals. Partly, by the way, Russian special services should take credit for that. They work to keep them split, and thank them for that. So these ugly forces are not a force. And I agree with, I think Steve, or you said that people in Russia are not in the mood for violence. So if there is a free playing field, then I think moderate nationalists have a very good chance. Very ugly nationalists, which would come with mottos, let's kill all, I don't know, Chinese, Americans, Afghans, let's kick them out of Moscow, let's kick them out of our cities. I think if we're talking about a range, which is fairly theoretical, I don't think we will live to see it soon, a free playing field and many parties competing in a genuine fashion, I don't think we will see a rise of a really powerful xenophobic nationalist party.
Actually, in part, directed towards Steve Fish, who's not here, but it's relevant for the other panelists as well. So I'm not a Russia specialist, but as a student of East Asia and comparative political economy, as he was talking about the demophiliac, I couldn't help but think about what Thomas Johnson talks about in terms of the sustaining the developmental state, the soft authoritarian. And so in a way, could we think of Putin as a soft authoritarian? And I know that in the literature, or there's some growing debate in the literature on Russia about the new developmental state that is now Russia. And, but at the same time, I do think the existence of the soft authoritarian could reconcile with these other developments that the other two panelists have talked about. Because if you think about the experience in East Asia, what happened was that these developmental states and their authoritarian leaders began to be challenged by social movements, by societal movements, and some of these these social movements are really people of, strange bedfellows that that in my mind reflects or resembles some of these new the social movement that's now arising in Russia today. And in terms of the kind of these structural variables that Steve Hansen talks about, I mean, certainly the literature on East Asia talked about some of those structural variables that sustained, countries like South Korea and Taiwan for like 50 to 70 years, Mexico, state-society relations that really, made a huge difference. But ideas and, global circumstances, the wave of democratization and ideas then began to formate this, these social movements that really did then topple down the regime. And I'm not saying that, Russia today is necessarily like a Taiwan or South Korea in the 1990s and the 2000s, but I was just kind of thinking about that as you guys made all your observations and felt they could be reconcilable. Thank you.
Thanks for the question. I'll take a shot at standing in for both Steves. The biggest difference is the nature of the political economies of the East Asian, tigers or whatever you want to call them, from ET and the Japanese Miracle on. They're export-led growth. They're focused on taking products at later stages of the product cycle and, therefore building up technology so that you can compete more and more. We know this literature very well. But it's interesting to compare Russia because nothing like that's happened at all. So it's not export-led growth. It's part of hydrocarbon economy. Russian technology remains woefully behind. There is this effort to do a top-down kind of Soviet-style planned version of this at this place called Skolkovo, which is supposed to be the Silicon Valley of Russia. But it's so funny because Silicon Valley is exactly the opposite, right? It's people in their garages, a lot of them at Stanford, sad to say that here at Berkeley, some of them in Berkeley, and they were, experimenting and doing things on their own, and in some cases dropping out of college like Steve Jobs, and, they ended up with this incredibly powerful engine of innovation. In the Russian case, you had a command, from Putin, obviously, but Medvedev, the figurehead. We're going to build Silicon Valley. Everyone make your bid. Those closest to Putin get the bids, and we start building according to the plan. And, the results have been, as you might expect, not very spectacular. That's just one project, right? So let alone trying to transform the entire Russian economy. There are pockets of innovation, of course, where you've had foreign direct investment, especially where there are ways to take advantage of Russia's fairly inexpensive labor, less unionized labor compared to parts of Western Europe. So automobile manufacture has gotten upgraded. It's not as if it's all just, you don't want to have an image in your head of it all looking like 1992 or something. It's definitely a different economy now than it was 20 years ago. And this is one reason Russians see that and they react positively to the changes. But the heart of the economy is hydrocarbons. It leads to all the pathologies of our rentier state. And so I just don't think you can classify Putin's dictatorship as a developmental dictatorship in the classic sense.
Yeah, I mostly agree with everything that Steve said. To give an idea just to what extent Russia depends on the exports of oil, over 50% of revenues, budget revenues, are accounted for by oil and gas. This is higher than it was just a few years ago. And this, to a great extent, defines the political economy of the country. Global circumstances matter for this mere reason. If oil drops from 116 where it is now to maybe 80, this may even have a sanitizing effect. And actually, there are already contingency plans in the government. And they will have to cut down some of the expenditures. And here I would go back to Steve Fish and say there is a reasonable degree of sane governance. There are plans for the time when oil might drop, and the plan is to cut down on some of the most irrational expenses, but not the social expenditures, because this is key to Putin's grip on power. Keep people reasonably compliant. However, if it drops lower, or if it drops and stays there, because we had a drop in late 2009, the drop was to $40 a barrel, and that was when the Kremlin grew really hysterical, and we saw very strange things happening. But it popped back up fairly fast, and the regime regained the status quo and muddled on or went on up until the protests. So if it drops and stays there, quite a lot of interesting things are possible. For better or worse, nobody can tell, but it will make a major difference in how things stand. It's just Putin has been such a perennially lucky guy that the oil, this is why he probably thinks of himself as God chosen. He only lived through this one drop in late 2009, and then it went back up again. On strange bedfellows, well, I mentioned this when I answered the question about alliances. We have a extremely fragmented liberal camp. By the way, I don't like the word opposition when we talk about Russia. They're protesters. These are people who are discontent, suddenly vocal ever since December, vocal and eager to act, but not exactly act politically. when it comes to politics, it turns out they hold entirely different opinions. And even if you look at the crowd, and by the way, Yuri was in Moscow for our latest big rally in early June, and I think all of us paid attention, because even more than on previous occasions, the crowd, maybe 50,000 people, was very diverse. People with red flags, people with very ugly xenophobic, chanting very ugly xenophobic lines, even clashes, more verbal than, Pussy Riot defenders who would be in the gay lesbian community, and fundamentalists who are not happy to see them, and this is to say the least. All sorts of verbal clashes. So for them to come together politically is, at this point in time, there is no chance of that. And same goes for the nationalist camp, for the xenophobic nationalist camp, which also has an extremely fragmented range of, from really people who kill or want to kill, to those who talk about what kind of policy we should have with labor migrants, which is, by the way, a huge problem. So strange bedfellows coming together did not happen in Russia when it was just about two bedfellows and not so strange. Through earlier periods, there were two liberal parties. To an outsider, not much difference between the two, both led by intellectuals, Muscovites, good education. It seemed like there is nothing to separate them, and yet they could never come together. And there has always been talk that if only these two would have come together with their following, this would have been a turning point in Russian politics. We would have a powerful liberal force with, which cares about human rights and values and democracy and what have you. Never happened. Never happened. And now we are not even talking about two similar ones. We're talking about scores of very different ones, and not even political groups. It's just motley groups of people who seem to share some ideas within them, not between them.
Okay, well, if you need someone on an airplane, to keep people entertained while something is happening in the cockpit, you want Masha on board that airplane. Anyway, actually, I was going to propose that we repair to the library and hide from Steve Fish, and then watch him walk in and find no one here. But he's back, thank goodness. So let's thank our panelists, who I think did a terrific job. Thank you very much.
Well, Добрый вечер. I have to say this event at Berkeley, and Steve should be going first, because I said I'm not the scholar, and he said that's why you should go first. This is an event which, these things are hard to do, and they take a lot of work. And they over time, and Alan and Larry have been doing this stuff and nailing down details in your airline tickets, and somebody put pepper in those sandwiches, and I'm going to raise hell about that. But it just takes a lot. But there are big decisions that have to be taken. What's it about, and who's coming, right? We took risks on What's It About by pairing two parts of the world, which don't really have much to do with each other. And it worked. It worked. And so sometimes things work. I thought there was a lot of cross-illumination. We actually didn't take any risks with participants. We eliminated the risks because, I will tell you this, we invited people who were certified by your former dissertation advisors, or by your second cousin, or by the FSB or something. You were certified as being great communicators, and you were. There wasn't, there wasn't a week. Usually these things, there's, oh God, when's this kid? Bozo gonna hit the road. But it didn't happen once at all. And I really congratulate you, and I kind of congratulate Steve and Alan and others who took those good decisions. Steve, I hope will talk about where this goes at Berkeley, which is really, I'm an eternal guest at Berkeley. I pretend to work, and they don't even pretend to pay me. But I love it. I love the community. When I came here from my alma mater, Princeton University, I pleased everybody by saying how wonderful it was. I'm sorry this doesn't apply to all of you from other universities, but how wonderful it was to be at a public university. And I still believe that enormously. I believe it's just fundamental. And this conference, I see in that light practitioners. I'm a sort of an ex-practitioner, now a kind of a pretend activist. Bob is, I guess you're the same, aren't you?
I try to be.
Yeah, yeah.
I try to,
but
in your shadow.
Both of us have a view of a conference like this, which is maybe different from Steve's view, in a sense. Though we learn enormously from you, we're concerned about what is going to make for better decisions. Not just decisions by the U.S. government, but Masha, decisions by people on the street in Moscow. What is the impact of this? It's not just understanding it and reaching normative conclusions. What's it going to change? So I think that's important. I was very struck by something that Steve said in the last panel in the form of a comment. You pointed out something that I had missed, but you scholars, of course, know it intimately, and that is that there was a deterioration in the appreciation of what you called area expertise and studies in about 1991, I think you said. Just at the time, my God, when one would have thought that that was so true. I was fascinated to learn a few years ago. I was, like everybody else, writing and thinking about, Iraq and how that got screwed up and everything, and why a bad idea became worse. And I learned in remarkable self-correction that the category of professional contract employee being most hired by the Department of Defense had become cultural anthropologists. Now, isn't that extraordinary? And I think, you would hope, that a self-correction of that kind is emerging in the academy. But I certainly see an experience like this as being an effort to come to that outcome, okay? But thank you very much for the insight, and I now understand it better. So I shut up now, and I go back as a guest, and I turn it over to the professional, our faculty mentor and champion, leader, sartorial stylist, and great post-Soviet expert, now broadened to
post.
Yeah, post, broadened to include the world. And I just have one other thing. I was thinking of Steve's book in Indonesia, and how you should all read at least the parts that are in words. I couldn't get the parts that were in numbers, but I did want to say that our handbook did arrive, and there are something like 20 copies here if anyone wants one for free. I think they're in the library. I'm out. Thank you very much.
That's great. Thank you so much, Sherry. First of all, I'd just like to echo Jeremy's gratitude to the organizers of the conference. I was, I guess, the main faculty organizer, but Jack Citron and Pradeep Chibber were also sponsors and organizers of the conference. But the guys who really did the heavy lifting were Jeremy himself and Alan Unger, who really put it together. He's the guy who really pulled everything together, and Larry Michalak. All these guys did, and we had a lot of other help along the way. Catherine Michael and Alice Ciciora and many others actually helped us put the conference together. And so I'm very grateful to them. Now, where do we go from here with the conference? First of all, just a word on the conference itself. It did come off, I think, very well. I think this showed that there's absolutely nothing but synergies when it comes to area expertise and theoretical knowledge. Every panel was loaded with both of those qualities, and I learned a great deal from each one of the panels here at the conference, and I think it came off really very well. Now, where do we go from here? As George Breslauer, our provost, announced when he was making his introductory remarks yesterday, this conference is the founding event or the inaugural event in the founding of a new center on campus, the Center for Political Development and Democracy. Now, what we're going to do at that center depends on us. It depends on you. Everyone who is a panelist here, if you're a Berkeley faculty member, will certainly be recruited as a member of the Berkeley Steering Committee of the new Center for Political Development and Democracy. And the panelists who are coming from outside Berkeley will certainly be recruited as members of the External Advisory Board of the Center for Political Development and Democracy. I can promise you, you must say yes to this, and I can promise no work is involved. It will just be more fun like this in the future, okay? We'll invite you for conferences and pay your way and such if the center gets off the ground, but we'll never demand anything other than your good name for the center, and that's what we'll be after when we ask you to serve in that capacity. What we have in mind in terms of the Center for Political Development and Democracy, and the fact that its faculty sponsors include not only myself and Pradeep Chibber, who work on developing in post-communist countries, but also Jack Citron, who's a specialist in American politics, is that the center will focus on promoting research not only in developing countries such as Tunisia, or for that matter, I suppose Russia could still be considered a developing country, but also on little issues like the quality of democracy in advanced industrialized countries that already have democracy. The quality of democracy in France, or the United States, or Japan are not small issues, and they seem to be becoming more salient every year. Most existing centers on democracy or democracy promotion in the United States, at least right now, focus very much on democratization or de-democratization, regime change. We're going to be concerned in our center with promoting research on the quality of democracy in existing democracies as well. I think that's relevant both to people in fledgling neo-democracies and also, of course, to the many people who live in established democracies. We're also capturing a lot of the expertise we have in Berkeley here among East Asianists and Europeanists and Americanists who actually study in one or another of the social science or humanities departments democracy here at home and in other advanced industrialized countries. Furthermore, when it comes to studying democratization and studying developing and post-communist countries, we'd like to actually foster research that focuses not only on institutions and not only on the rule of law, as important as those things are, but also on political development. This is why I built this into the title of the center, on public service provision, on state building, on things that help determine whether neo-democracies will actually survive because they're able to deliver the goods. Again, tapping a kind of part of the Berkeley personality and the expertise we have here on campus, deep expertise in questions of political development, public administration, and so on. That's all going to be the kind of research that our center will seek to foster. So now we need to put together advisory boards, we need to put together some sort of leadership structure, get a website up, and we need, of course, to raise some money. So while you will be, everyone here will be part of the project in your capacity, and we'll be asking you for support. We won't be asking you for money, but we will be asking you to be asking others for money. And so we will be seeking funds from external sources. We will perhaps even hope to scrape up a modest bit of capital here on campus to start our center. But that's all for coming months and years. But we're delighted to have this thing started. There's so much energy and so much interest among faculty and graduate students and center affiliates on campus in all these issues we've been dealing with and all the issues I'm talking about right now. And yet we lack a center that focuses these interests and this energy on campus. We now have one. We're still kind of running with it. It's a new organization. We still need to get the letterhead in the office space, but I think this conference is a very auspicious start to the foundation of this center. So I want to thank everybody for coming. A special thanks to our guests from overseas who came here from the likes of Russia, Tunisia, and India to join us. All very distinguished people, as well as our people who flew to us from closer here in the United States, from all over the United States, as well as our Berkeley affiliates, and the people who came to us from abroad. and or from elsewhere in the United States who got their PhDs here, who are Berkeley luminaries, people like Monsef, who actually is now a very prominent Tunisian politician and leader, who actually has a very deep Berkeley connection. What year did you get your PhD here, Monsef?
I won't say it in front of ladies.
You won't say, okay. You want to tell us what year? Something, I think it was between 1998 and 2000, somewhere in there.
Thank you,
Is where he got his
thank you.
PhD. But we have,
That's a
we
good
have
lie.
many of the eminent figures here, including our practitioners and our politicians and our policy analysts, have either taught at Berkeley as adjunct professors or they got their PhDs here. And you can see that in their biographies as well. So this conference, I feel like, really showcased our talent and the energy we have at Berkeley here in the study of democracy and democratization and the barriers to democracy and deepening of democracy. And I just want to thank everybody very much for coming.
Bravo.
Bravo.
I'll just say one last word on behalf of Jack Citron, who had to leave. He wanted to thank everyone for coming and for the support of this conference. Also Pradeep, the two of them got together with Jeremy and Steve months ago and said, let's do this, and they appreciate everybody's support and attendance.
And believe it or not, Jeremy's idea of focusing on Tunisia and Russia, countries just picked, were picked at random. This was before either the Arab Spring or the Russian winter. In 2010, he said, let's just do Tunisia and Russia. So, go figure. There you go.
What's happening next?
I'm looking next to free Texas, if you want.
Totally. Ollie Ivans is gone. We need a champion.
That's a formidable task.
Steve, Steve, sorry.
One more speech. One more speech.
One more thing. I would like to say a word. Is it possible?
Sure, of course.
Il est le seul élu.
Oh, merci beaucoup.
Il est le seul. He's the only one here
I'm
who's
saying
elected.
this to get some more votes in the next election. You know, Camus wrote a book called L'Étranger. All of you have read it. I don't know if you say The Stranger in English, Stranger. And then Edouard Said wrote a critique of this book. And what he said is that the book is great. The story of the man and the woman and the drama is wonderful. But he complained about the fact that the Europeans had, in this book, had names, had histories, had stories, had feelings, happiness and sadness, while the Arabs were kind of des ombres, shadows. The Arab was there, maybe had a knife, etc. And throughout the book, that's what he was. That's the feeling my people had before independence and after independence. Since Frantz Fanon, who probably Berkeley knows very well Frantz Fanon, has written only 2 books. He died very early of the same, for the same reason as Edouard Said, as a matter of fact. Frantz Fanon, a Guadeloupean, supported the Algerian Revolution, wrote a first book called The Wretched of the Earth, explaining why colonialism is leading people to suffer. But the second book is even more important and less known. It is called White Faces and Black Masks. And he was telling Africans, watch out, once you get independence, don't behave exactly as if you were working for the colonialists. You are inside the colonialist, but you are just wearing a black mask saying you are African from Africa. Very important book, because many of the governments after independence for 50 years did not work for their people. There was no democracy. They were working for their patrons, for their bosses, wherever they were, in Moscow, in Washington, in Paris, or in Beijing. Democracy is bringing those shadows of Camus to the light. We do exist. And is telling those shadows, organize yourself so that your interests are best served for yourself. So This is why I value this conference a lot. Of course, my heart goes to Berkeley, but as you know, Stanford has been inviting us to democracy meetings where a Moroccan prominent king of the king is there. Harvard is advising the Tunisian parliament with many topics, mainly the constitution. Noah Feldman wrote a beautiful piece, op-ed in the Washington Post and the New York Times, saying, comparing the brotherhood in Egypt to a Nahda and how they will behave in the future, facing future elections. Very important piece. So I was happy to get the aid, the help from Harvard and from Stanford. Today I am the happier, or the happiest of them all, because Berkeley, my alma mater, that taught me democracy, as I said this morning, not only the university, but the city, but my neighbors, but the street, but proposition A, B, C, D. And we are here. So thank you very much for this meeting. And as a very famous British author said, I can resist everything except temptation. So if we can go with your idea, I'll be there. Thank you very much.
Bravo.